All right. Do we want to try the graphics now? Let's see if this works. We're still playing around.
Let's see.
Walk the Talk America presents
Doesn't
Guns
look,
and Mental Health,
or it's a little delayed.
podcast for firearms owners, clinicians, and the curious public.
I think that worked. We're here. Let's see if it carries over into the recording. Good morning, everybody from the Pacific time zone, and good midday to everybody else. We're up early, and Michael Sudini is on assignment, but the rest of us are here. Eddie and I are a little under the weather, but Brandon is going to lead us in a discussion of the stages of grief, which I think is something that's going to impact not just the listening audience, but probably you're going to go home and tell this to people too, because as we go through griefs and losses of various things, it doesn't just have to be human death. It could be lots of things can die. Jobs can die. Relationships can die.
The Cowboys could
hobbies.
Suck in the playoffs and lose.
The Cowboys could get murdered by the Packers. That's a Jara, if she's listening, will like that one. She's a big Packers fan. So, yeah. So I think the idea is as we introduce this stuff to people's ears and minds, we want you to absorb it, and then we also want you to take it and integrate it into your lives. Like, we don't want it just to be an academic exercise where you listen and go, that's an interesting conversation, but actually incorporate this, right? Use it, make yourselves better, make life better, and stay out of our clinics. That's the whole point of this thing. We're trying to work ourselves out of jobs. So, Brandon, all schools are closed in your county today, you say. And Eddie, it's snowing again. Over here in northern Nevada, it's supposed to be 52 and sunny.
Wow. Yeah, it's been very gray here for the last 3 weeks, and snowing a couple.
You're in Ohio, though. It's always gray, right?
It's always gray.
Yeah.
Except for 2 months in the summer.
Yeah, nothing new there. Okay. So, how do we want to kick this off? Does anybody want to chime in on what their idea of this is, or do we just want to wind up Brandon and let him go? Seems like the latter is probably preferred.
Wind him up and let him go.
We're gonna vote on it.
Yeah, let's do it.
Robert's rules and.
Yeah,
I seek a motion. Yep.
Right.
I'll seek a motion to open the meeting with Brandon. Is there a second? There's a second. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. Aye. Motion carries unanimously. Brandon, the floor is yours.
Good grief. Go for it, Brandon, please.
Awesome. Alrighty. So, I thought it'd be cool when we were trying to figure out who was going to be teaching this week. I thought this would be a cool topic just because everyone goes through grief at some point. So knowing the stages of grief can help normalize what you're going through. A lot of Jake, and it's not just death. Stages of grief were mainly found for death, but there's a lot of other things that die, because grieving, it's not just you're grieving death, you're grieving the loss of something. So I got to not look at this chat while we're going here. You guys are killing me. So essentially just to kind of start with some history. So stages of grief, they were developed by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. They were really developed for people that were going through terminal illness. So people that were pretty much on their deathbeds. Later, though, that was translated to grief in general. It was found that, loved ones and family members were going through these same stages. So the stages, what they are, I'll go over them, just kind of let you know what they are right now, and then we'll go over them in a little more detail in a little bit. But we've got denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. So a few things that I like to stress when going over this, just when I'm teaching it and with my clients, is the stages don't necessarily happen in order. So you can go through them in any order, and you don't necessarily go through all of them. There's a saying that, everybody grieves differently. I think that is very, very true. A lot of it's how you handle it. But with those stages, like I mentioned, you can go through all of them. You can go through some of them, but that's essentially what we got there. You can be in more than one stage at a time. I think most commonly see is anger and depression. I think that's the biggest combination, but it can really be any combination. It could be 2 or 3 or even all. Another one is like acceptance and depression. So just because you get to acceptance does not mean that you can't revisit the other stages. So for example, let's say somebody passes away, a year goes by, you kind of hit acceptance, you go through the stages, and then maybe an anniversary comes up. Maybe it's their death anniversary. Maybe it's, another sort of special anniversary, like a birthday. But essentially, or maybe it's like even like something like a fragrance that they used to wear that you smell. Any of those things can put you back into like depression or anger or something like that. But just because you go back does not mean that you're not in acceptance.
Brandon,
another quote that people say that I hear. Oh, yeah.
May I jump in real quick? I want to ask about if there's a parallel to the stages of change. And I know we haven't taught that on here, but just inside baseball real quick, and then later we can address it. But are you seeing parallels, or maybe anybody, are you seeing parallels to the stages of change where you can go through them, slip back, leapfrog? Does that make sense?
I'd say absolutely. Just because like I know there's mainly like the 5 stages of change, but like that arguable 6 stages relapse. So obviously that can kind of set you back into some of the other stages. So yeah, so I'd say definitely for sure. Okay,
cool. Yeah, please continue. I just want to throw that out there and see if I was tracking with you.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Good. What the people say is that there's no right or wrong way to grieve. I think there is, some wrong ways to grieve, which we'll kind of get into because like what can happen or a complicated grief or can of worms, essentially what you have and I'll hopefully get into in a little. But what I want to do now is just kind of jump in so you can open up to these stages. It's important to go through these because a lot of this is we're normalizing what we're feeling. I know something that Jake is really passionate about is emotional functioning and emotional awareness. And I think when you're going through a grieving process and you're aware of these stages of grief, I think that this can be really helpful. So first stage, like I mentioned, and these are usually taught in this order. But like I said, you can go through these in any order, but I'll just kind of go through in the order that they're typically taught in. So first we have denial. So that is essentially that, So that's essentially the shock and numbness. So like this can't be that really shock feeling that you get right when you find out someone passes away or, like when you figure out that you lose something. And sometimes, that can last, a little bit. Sometimes it can be a really long time. So I was getting a complicated grief a little bit ago. So an example of how that can happen is let's say, you're in denial for a really long time, like several months, and then several months go by, you never really feel any other emotions. And then you feel guilt for feeling any emotions before, and that can kind of lead to complicated grief. An example of denial is, let's say somebody gets like some sort of a cancer diagnosis and their spouse is just not accepting it. They just can't believe that it's, coming. They think that there's got to be something else that can be done. There's got to be more tests that they can that can be ran. So that's kind of what you get when you're looking at denial. Second stage, we've got anger. So with with death, and grieving, it can be cruel and unfair. So just, not to be too graphic, but, think of an infant passing away. Or maybe there's a really great person that you're really fond of and they die, a horrific death. It might be a slow, painful death. There's really no answers as to why that stuff happened and it pisses them off. Therefore, you've got that anger. And then anger, it can kind of branch out into a lot of other different directions. It can be anger towards the person who died. Maybe they wronged you in some way. Maybe they weren't a great person. I can give a personal testimony. My grandfather, when my grandmother passed away, he was upset with her because he said that she was supposed to wait for him. So that's just kind of another example about how anger can play out. It can be anger towards ourselves for not closure that we thought. Maybe we wanted to apologize to that person. Maybe they wanted to thank them for. So it could be towards ourselves for not doing everything that we could. And every time we talk about anger, and I know I've mentioned this on this podcast before, and I know it was touched on when Jake taught on emotional functioning, but anger is a secondary emotion. So think about, when you're angry, through a grieving process, think about some of those emotions that are underneath that anger. So, you've got grief, you've got sadness, you've got confusion, guilt, A lot of things like that. So and that's just kind of more to say that it's really important that you are really aware of your emotions and go through, through the grieving process. So moving on to bargaining, essentially that's making deals with ourselves or a higher power. So, maybe thinking that things will get better if we act a certain way or if we do things differently. It could be praying to a higher power, which I want to be very clear, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But, essentially that's what you're seeing when you're in that bargaining stage. It can also be a lot of what if questions. You're not necessarily, bargaining, but you're in that bargaining mindset of like, what if I would have done this? What if this person would have done this? What if this would have played out differently? Would this person still be gone? So essentially that's what you get when you're looking at bargaining. Depression, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here because I think we all know, what depression is when it comes to grief, but it's essentially that sadness that comes in waves. And I think a really big important, kind of like how anger, that go with a lot of different, criteria that go with depression. So a lot of times people think depression just means you're sad, right? So with depression, it's not just sadness. It can be loss of interest in doing things. It can be just not having any motivation. It can be trouble sleeping. It can be not having any appetite. So these are all, kind of things to look out for, when you're going through the grieving process. Even if you're not feeling that main sadness, those are some other indicators that can kind of let you know that, hey, you might be kind of like in a depression mindset. So then as far as the last one, we've got acceptance. So I think the most important thing to think when it comes to acceptance is that acceptance does not mean that you are okay with it. To kind of give a parallel to, what we do and the 2A community is we accept the fact that there are people trying to take our rights and we're doing stuff about it. We're not okay with it, but we're accepting that, it kind of is what it is. And that stuff is happening. So when it comes to death or grieving, acceptance does not mean that you're okay with it. It's when you're able to acknowledge that loss and acclimate to life without that person. So as far as just some applications, so I think that it's really important because you're able to, again, acknowledge and normalize your feelings. I think being able, because one thing that I always tell people is that time is your best friend when you're going through a grieving process. The reason that, we know what the 5 stages of grief are and the reason that like we know all the stuff that we're going over now is because it's happened so much to so many different people. So it's normal to go through this stuff when people pass away, but the more you can acknowledge those emotions, the better it's going to be for you to kind of get you through that process. Kind of like we were talking about earlier, this just doesn't pertain to death. And I know we can go a lot of different directions here, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time, but think about an end of a relationship. If, a spouse breaks up with you, you can be, in denial, like thinking like, okay, there's no way this can be happening. You can be bargaining, saying like, okay, I'll change, I'll do this differently, let's try couples counseling, things like that. But, and then obviously depression and anger come with that. But it even could be like a crappy upbringing. I have a lot of the work that I do is trauma oriented, and I have a lot of clients that have, really like abusive backgrounds, but it's kind of like they're mourning the loss of a childhood or they're mourning the loss of a life that they never had. And it's kind of, okay, how are we going to get through this grieving process of that and get you into acceptance to kind of like change what's in the here and now? I mentioned a little bit earlier about complicated grief. So there is actually a new diagnosis. It's in the DSM, the new edition of the DSM-5. It's called prolonged grief disorder. I'm not going to get into all the criteria of it, but essentially it's when the symptoms last 6 to 12 months or longer, and it's just completely impacting with your ability to function. You can't move on. You can't stop thinking about that person. You've got somatic symptoms. It's impacting your ability to work, impacting your relationships. But that's kind of like, if all this stuff goes unchecked, that's what it can lead to. So again, being aware of this stuff, being aware that like, time is your best friend when going through those, and just knowing that what you're going through is normal, I think is just really important when we're going through this. To kind of wrap up, just like this segment of it, there's something that one of my supervisors did when she was going over brief training with us. and she gave, it's called the pain button analogy. It's kind of weird, but if you imagine you have a box, and inside the box in one corner, you've got a pain button. So that button just represents pain. Inside the box, you also have a ball that kind of acts like a balloon. It inflates and deflates. So that balloon represents grief. So if you're holding this box and you just went through a grieving process, so that grief is still really, really strong, that balloon is going to be very large. So no matter how gentle you are with moving this box around, it's going to keep hitting that pain button, and you're going to be in a lot of pain. But as you go through time, as you kind of acknowledge the pain and just kind of deal with it the best way you can, that balloon eventually gets smaller and smaller, and you've got more wiggle room with the box. So that is essentially, in a nutshell, the 5 stages of grief, and why I think that they're important, and why I think it's good to teach your normal ones. So any questions or any
Yeah, I
discussion?
have one from the chat. That's a great analogy, by the way. I'd never heard that balloon button analogy. That's really cool, and I'm gonna use that. I'm just gonna tell you that's my takeaway right now, because I love a good metaphor. Cheeky Mare says, I'm grieving loss of a romantic relationship. It was short, so I don't expect to be grieving too long. And that made me think, in your guys' view, and I think I know the answer, but I want to hear you all say it, say what you think. In your guys' view, does duration have as much to do with the duration of the relationship, or the connectivity with the thing that you lost, have as much to do with duration of the grief process, or is it more intensity? Because I know both can play in, but you can have a really short, intense relationship and be grieving for a really long time and be really wounded. But I'm just wondering what everybody's experience is.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess I jump in real quick. Yeah, there's going to be a correlation to it. It'd be tough to say, because yeah, intensity matters absolutely. Something that rocks us to the core might have even been a very brief thing, but it was so intense, it was so important to us, or so traumatic that the dealing with it can be outsized the duration of it. Now that said, there's something to time, right? There's something to just time in a relationship. We think of maybe, yeah, I'm recalling numerous people, numerous conversations I've had with people who's, they maybe had an uncle, right? An uncle passed. They knew he was going to pass, from this illness. At least that was the likely thing. And then maybe they didn't have a particularly close relationship with him. And oddly enough, there was all this that came from that. They checked in maybe at holidays, and was about it. And so on their day to day, the relationship wasn't particularly, as they would define it, close. But in the passing, there, because of that duration, because maybe the relationship, and maybe regrets, and what if I checked in more? I mean, all these things come flooding in, or can. And so I guess it's like so many things. It's really tough to tell until you're faced with it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Eddie, do you have some?
Yeah, I'm gonna think. For me, I think it's more the intensity of it, because like how you said, like the family members, like we all have family members that we're not exactly that close to, but maybe at the end, like the thoughts come rolling back to us. But a lot of the times, like when I've experienced grief, it's the intensity of the relationship. Um, like I've lost friends and coworkers, and some, okay, yeah, that sucks, they're gone. But then like the ones that you're really close to, that then you form the meaningful relationship, like the intensity of that, like formalized relationship, the bonds that you make, I think is what really dictates how long that grieving process goes, at least for me.
Also very relevant. Brandon, what's your idea? I mean, you're presenting on this. You studied it probably more than a lot of people.
Yeah, I'd say definitely a little bit of both, like, time and intensity. This is going to be a very, very odd analogy, so forgive me, or example, so forgive me. But like, just trying to think of like, personal experience, somebody like, right now, all of my grandparents have been deceased. Those have been relationships though that have been very close. And, I had them since I was a kid all the way up into my, 20s and 30s. So as far as like time, that's like a really good indicator of, or it's a really good example of how, time in the grieving process has really impacted me. And then the other one is, like I'm an animal lover, and I mentioned this on the podcast, but I had a cat that was 15 years old. And, when you have an animal, a lot of times you have those routines they're like with you every night. So it's like that was more of, it was a shorter relationship, but it was a very intense relationship just because, like it's, that like human animal bond. So I think, both of them definitely, play a big part for sure.
Kevin, you had some questions.
Yeah, I was interested more from your guys' standpoint when you hear somebody walk in and say, I just lost this individual. What's your thought process? Are you guys trying to find what stage of grief they're in and help them through just that particular one? Are you taking a more kind of overview approach to it? How do you handle that when you first learn someone's dealing with that when they walk in?
I'll tell you very briefly, my experience is not very often that people walk in right after something happens. Usually it's because scheduling alone requires a little bit of a time lag. But I regularly get text messages and emails, phone calls from people who are asking on behalf of somebody else who had a tragedy befall them and say, who do you recommend for grief counseling? And I said, when did this happen? I said, yesterday. I'm like, give it 4 weeks. Like bare minimum, give it 4 weeks, maybe even 6. I want to see how, especially with children, by the way, children and older folks, like north of 45-ish, because most of us have walked the planet long enough to endure some level of loss, death, destruction that we can bounce back in a pretty decent time frame without needing professional psychotherapy. And children also, we don't know what their developmental stage is to receive this information. So I just say, give it time. And if you see odd behaviors after about a month and a half, then go ahead and make the appointment. But by and large, people recover pretty quickly and they don't need professional assistance. So that's my take. But to your point, yeah, there isn't an assessment that goes along with it, when they show up. And it's usually well after the incident.
Yeah. I would say for me, I think that honestly, coaching my patients through grief for me personally is one of the most difficult. And that's because a lot of times as a counselor, what I want to do is I want to help them explore options to, help them. Like, how can we make this better? But if somebody passes away or like, they're losing a relationship, there's really nothing we can do to bring that person back. So that's kind of a roadblock that we have. So what I do is I start by, I kind of keep where they at, like in the stages, sell them, but it's something that I just kind of keep in the back of my mind. Your question, Kevin, like what I start by just allowing them to talk. I ask them questions about that person, like, tell me about how your relationship with this person was. What did they bring into their relationship? What was it that you liked about them? What are some good memories that you had with them? And really just, talking about them, because what you're doing is you're really just kind of getting to, know that person, kind of through the person that you're talking to, and you're allowing them to kind of go through their emotions that they probably wouldn't be going through on their own. And then, kind of what I do is very similar to what I just did here with just kind of going over the stages of grief and like the application. Like I don't do all the talking that I just did. Obviously, I leave more. I ask a lot of questions, but what I do is I teach them this stuff and just kind of let them stuff that you can expect, and just know that this is normal.
Yeah, I think that we also need to battle what typically creeps into people's minds, which is that there's something to be solved. There's something to be achieved, and we want to make sure that we don't insert our own opinions and our own judgments and our own biases and our own desires into this individual's process, because the presumption isn't necessarily that they need to get through it. The presumption isn't necessarily that they need to sit in it, for example. They don't need to, quote unquote, process it, right? Sometimes people just need to talk, identify, understand, and they're done, right? Sometimes happiness on the back end is not the goal. So we like to Brandon's point, we just let them talk. We let them talk for a long time. It's grief counseling to me is a little different than the traditional mental illness counseling, if I can use that term, where somebody's really struggling with something that's interfering with their life and has got them off track, that's not anchored to sadness, insofar as the goal is very imprecise. The goal is usually more precise if you're dealing with anxiety or depression or a mood disorder of some sort, because you can see what the interfering behaviors are, and you say, well, we just need to get rid of those, right? But with grief, it's like, well, how do you know when you're done? And to Brandon's point earlier when he was presenting, anniversaries, memories, scents, visual stimuli, they'll go on forever. And so it's almost about a subjective analysis of when the individual thinks that they're done. So we really want to be careful about not assigning them a goal that's based on our worldview. Excuse me, I'm really struggling, and Eddie was struggling too, so he dropped off.
Well, I mean, there's a question in the chat, from Hinchcliffe talking about, is the time that needs to happen, does that work equally for physical depression? And he said, or Hinchcliffe said, like a post-op.
That's
surgical.
Sharon, by the way. Sharon's amazing. If you guys don't know
Excellent.
Sharon, she's outstanding. Go on.
Versus, like an emotional depression, a diagnosis of cancer, death of a loved one. So does the time work equally or comparatively for a physical versus maybe an emotional? And since I'm speaking now, I'd say, gosh, there's so much that depends on that. I would say that there's often a big difference between something that's external versus something that's internal. So something where I don't control the variables, as if I control many variables anyway. But when something is outside of I'm not even a player in the system, but there's something, we could say oppressive about that. We could say something that's removed about that. And so that can be tough in a different way, but I don't know that it's necessarily, that makes that worse than an emotional thing. So, I mean, and that's the tough part about, living it. Like that's the worst part. And then counseling toward it, that's way less worse because, right, it's the other person's experience. But it's the tough part about counseling in it because, I don't know, and neither does the other person. This is going to be something that's tough, and it's going to, just as we say, these aren't going to be in order, and they may be recurring in terms of what stage you're in. And that recurring could be, once a year for, 7 years. It could be that anniversary date. And, I was talking to a patient just this week about an anniversary date coming up. And it's the first one, the first anniversary date coming up. I won't go into details beyond that, but, it's going to rock the family. And of course it's going to, and it's going to do it differently. And there's a saying, forewarned is forearmed. And I keep that in mind whenever I'm talking about grief with people. And because I think most of us know, okay, these are the stages of change, right? We've heard about them. There's movies about them. And the challenge with that is that the stuff that we just know, because it's in the common lexicon, we tend to not know. We don't, and how can we until we've actually experienced it? So I can know something academically and suck at it in real life, and that's often true, actually. And it's true for most of us. Until we've actually walked that path, we have no idea what it actually takes to do it. And so being forewarned is forearmed. And what I mean by that is these are things that will likely come up for you. And when you see them as part of the process, and you don't have to attach yourself to it. I don't have to drink myself to death out of my grief because I just chose to. And chances are, there's choosing involved in that, but chances are you are in that stage of grief of maybe denial or whatever that the case may be. And that's part of the process. And so something about knowing that, oh, wait, that the shrink told me about this, I kind of brushed it off because I already know all this stuff. But no, I guess this is what it looks like for me this time in this situation, going through it. And I think that there's something helpful in that. Something really helpful when we recognize that, yes, we're being drug around by this grief. Yes, it sucks. It hurts. And it hit us left field, even though we knew it was coming. There's something helpful there. So to the original question, it's tough to say. It's interesting because I don't think it's any one answer for any one person all the time as well. So I think that the emotional versus the physical absolutely varies. And that's what the grief is, a sucker punch, even when we see it coming.
Kevin, did you have something else?
Yeah.
You said you had a couple of questions. Or Brandon, okay.
Go for it, Brandon.
Oh no, I was just going to mirror what DB said. I mean, it really just depends on. I mean, I think he answered that perfectly. I don't have anything to add to it. Just to kind of mirror the fact that it's everybody goes through grief differently, and it really just kind of depends on the circumstances.
Yeah, it brings me to my next question. Obviously, everybody grieves differently, and every loss is different. Everybody kind of has different weight. That one thing might seem little, but it's big for that person. How do you kind of help people? Like Jake, you said people will text you, "Oh, this person lost blah blah blah." How do you kind of advise them to be a better friend, family member to somebody that's grieved, with knowing the knowledge of everybody grieves differently? I lost my mom at 21. And my wife lost her mom early, and we both handled it completely different, but the same exact loss on paper.
Sit in it.
Yeah.
Just sit. Don't do anything. And it sounds a little, I don't know, elementary. And this next thing that I'm going to say is going to sound overly simplistic and possibly condescending, but you don't try to help. You just be present. Now, I've said this before in different settings. Almost every time I teach emotional functioning, I probably say it, which is, your job is not to unmess the person's life if they had a crisis, right? Your job is to guide them through the crisis. If you get them back to the pre-crisis state and their life was a mess before the crisis, your job is not to go digging for more problems to solve everything, right? That's the bird's eye view. But you got to sit in it. And in order to sit in it, you have to know how to tolerate distress. And if you don't know how to tolerate your own distress, you're not going to be able to sit with somebody else in theirs. I have multiple times with a patient sitting in front of me in my office, in tears, confused, actually gotten up out of my chair and gotten sat next to them. Whether they're in a chair, I drag a chair over, or if they're on the couch, I just sit next to them physically, and I go, I don't have any answers, but I'm here. And then usually more tears come. And then what that does is it drains the limbic system. It helps to move some of that emotional energy through. And then, good yield theory sense, you can explore options after that. But oftentimes there's no options to explore. It's just to be endured. Joyce Meyer actually said this one time in a speech that she gave. She said, we got drive-through everything. There's drive-through fast food. There's drive-through video stores, drive-through liquor stores, but there's no drive-through breakthroughs. You have to go through to get through. And I think so often, out of our own inability to tolerate distress, we don't want to sit through somebody else's distress, so we want to leapfrog them through it or around it, or just ignore it or explain it away. And of course, we know that explaining hits the wrong part of the brain. It's the frontal lobe instead of the limbic system, which is where they are. So my advice is always just sit in it. Sit. And if you can't, well, then we got to figure out why you can't. That's a different topic altogether. But that's what I say. And it's very, very short, very simplistic. Sounds condescending, like you need to sit in your own distress before you can sit in somebody else's. But it's true. I think parents go through this a lot too when their kids are struggling. It's like, shut up, stop crying. It's like, oh, what's up with you, man, that you can't watch them cry? So, guys.
Well, yeah, I mean, just to really put a point on that, which you did, Jake, I think it's so challenging. We don't get to go around it. Let me take that back. Of course we can, right? We can numb it. We can do all kinds of things. We can dismiss it. But man, what a loss in that. We can't fast food the grieving process. It's just not going to work. And so it's one of the few things that just absolutely connects us to our true reality, to the true human experience, right? That this, like, we all are going to die. We're all going to experience suffering. We are all going to go through this stuff. And I'll often talk, it's January, and as we're recording this right now, I think it's still January. And so I use that as not that everybody should do New Year's resolutions, but what a great opportunity is. We're looking to make kind of a new chapter to move forward into this thing positively. And so I often talk about that there is this, we can use January or the 1st of January as a construct to push us towards this next chapter. And it's very positive and up, typically positive and uplifting, not really connected to anything in the family. It's just January. And gosh, grief is a very different way of marking time, very different way that will, likely, depending on what it is, likely will always be part of our lives. There's of course there are smaller griefs and very, very large griefs. And this is an opportunity. That I would say that is something that I very cautiously and very slowly eventually come to this. What does this next chapter mean? That's going to be well downstream of going through the grieving process. Now, but that said, little seeds hopefully can get planted through that time as people, are going through it. Often it's when people are reflecting on the meaning of, if it's death, for example, the parts of that person's life that were challenging or inspiring or all the things, right? And there is often a reflective thing back to ourselves as everything circles around how do we interpret it, what does it mean to us? And so the passing of a loved one or a great tragedy ultimately swims right back to what does this mean for me and for all those around me, and what a great opportunity it is, especially when let's take the passing of someone who was just pivotal in our lives, who was sentinel. There is probably no greater passing of a baton than that. This is maybe your time to pick that baton up. Now, we can only pick it up when we're ready to pick it up, or maybe it's just not our time. But that's something that I find is so potentially powerful in this. And Brandon, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you at some point through this episode, like how you handle this from an existential perspective, because I know that's one of your main approaches, and you
Get out of my head, Covey.
The one thing I want to know. But one thing I want to know is, I know it probably depends for different people, but when do you usually start that process?
Yeah, I mean, when to start is just like, when is grief? When are each of us going to be at different phases? And that's totally unknown. And usually maybe the
Sure.
academic answer, which in this case I would say is true, but it's tough to know it until you've done it a few times, is when is the person actually asking for it? When are they actually, when do I get the sense that they are kind of prodding me to say what they probably already are thinking? And that's usually actually what people say, like, man, thank you for saying what I was already thinking. And I just needed that. I just needed you to say it. And like, I'd love to say something witty or intelligent. I'd love to think that every now and then I get to do that. But I think what's most powerful is when I back up, or I like amen, brother, to what a person has already put out there. And, whether I've known it or not, I think those are the things that in all honesty, when I shut down my office for the day and I'm thinking about the day, those are the ones that do stick. Like, man, I'm so glad that I had some small part in backing up what this other person was trying to do, and they just needed maybe one person or just one more person to say yep, do it. So, and in terms of maybe the existential side, we're all going to approach this in different terminology, but for me, it comes to what does it mean, right? So that'd be the basic existential question. What does all of this mean? And from there, and that's, I've mentioned in the episode on existential psychotherapy, that's one of my first questions. I wrap up every intake with that. What gives life meaning? What makes life meaningful for you? And how do you know when you're on the path or when you aren't on the path? So if any of my patients who may be listening, this question, this is, we've discussed this from day one, and we bounce on it here and there as it comes up. And for me, that gives me an anchoring point. I can know that at least was said at one time. It may not be where they are now, and I'm not going to hold them to that. Like, remember you said that, like, no, I'm going to be very, very cautious in my rolling out of describing what this means. I'm I'm going to hold that to only to the utmost need. If I have a sense that I need to be a lifeline for a person, and just kind of like shake them out of something that I know that they can get through, but they just are stuck or in a really, really dark place. Other than that, just as Jake said, that's just, I don't want to insert my own process into their experience. It will be ineffective. It will be unappreciated, and I might feel good about it. But the worst case, a worst case in that was that they agree and then they're quiet. They agree and they just disengage, because I've just burnt that bridge. So I want to be really, really cautious with ascribing, what they said means, unless I really get a clear hint that they just need me to back that, and remind them of it. So it is a question of meaning, absolutely. And what a powerful time to be confronted with the stuff that we said. Jake.
Yeah, I was going to go somewhere else, and then you said that at the end there about shutting people down, and I think that that's probably the fear that the lay person has most of all. For whatever reason, counselors tend to be really arrogant. They think they have all the answers and they know what to say all the time, right? And Kevin says, that seems to be the mistake people make, is trying to make the perfect statement, acknowledging a loss, and then totally miss. I think another mistake we make is making an assumption that they need what we're about to say, but it's through our eyeballs, not theirs. And so we end up with a paralysis. And I think that where we get off is we get cool little words like "I wonder." Like phrases like, I wonder what this means for you. I'm just wondering, truly, honestly, I do wonder what this means. And then you're not telling them what the meaning is, and you're almost inviting them to find meaning without guidance or direction. You'd also say something like, it seems to me that, and it seems to me, and then say whatever you want to say. Or, geez, if I were going through this, I would probably, and then you share your opinion, because it's not theirs, it's you. You can sort of imagine what it might be like if you were, and then it softens the blow instead of directly saying, you're just fill in the blank, right? Nobody responds well to that, because it's directive and it's an imperative, and that's not good. So if you're hearing this and you're like, well, what do I say in the time that somebody's really struggling? Put yourself in a place of mystery and wonderment, and be very humble and curious, and let the curiosity and the humility guide the statements that come out of your mouth, and then they'll land much more softly. Sharon mentions to DB's point about validation and just saying something that somebody else is already thinking. She says it's nice to hear that confirmation is it's nice to hear confirmation that crying is cathartic. So tears actually contain cortisol, and so exuding tears releases chemicals from your body that are, cortisol is a stress hormone. So you're releasing toxic chemicals that don't need to be there. So crying is quite physiologically useful. But she invoked a word there, cathartic. That's a Jungian analytic psychological word. People use catharsis all the time, but I wanted to define what it means. What it means is an emotional release of energy, or a release of emotional energy, or a release of psychic energy. And I don't mean like psychic crystal ball, palm reading psychic, but like in your psyche, in your soul, you have energy. And when that energy gets stuck, it's called a cathexis. So stuck energy is a cathexis, a release of that energy is catharsis. But we don't want to be going cathexis, catharsis, cathexis, catharsis with stuck, release, because that's a pretty horrible way to live. You're always up and down. What we want is another really cool word called ebullition. In other words, a flow state of emotion and emotional energy, so that when you experience something, you embrace it fully, you acknowledge it, you set it aside, and then you move forward and be in the next moment fully present for whatever comes. And if you think about, if anybody's ever heard the term ebullient, like a bubbly personality, they're very happy, they're very in a flow. That's where that word comes from, is ebullition. It's a bubbling up, it's an effervescence of emotional energy that just flows through your soul. So we don't want to get into cathexes or stuck energy. we want to just have it flow through. And I think that's really important to the grief process, is when we get hit with something significant that is not just a mere blip of emotion, like failing to get your Dr. Pepper at Burger King, which is disappointing, but it's the permanent loss of a relationship or a job or a loved one or a piece of property or whatever it is. You don't bottle it up, stuff it down, and create a cathexis, because then you don't need the catharsis later. Catharses are great, and a lot of us are walking around with stuck energy, and sometimes we just need to go yell at the lake, or curse at God, or burst into tears, at a campfire or whatever it is, and that's fine. But then be aware not to allow yourself to go back into the stuck situation. We want to be fully present for life as it rolls through.
Well, and somebody mentioned, are there certifications in grief? And yes, there are. And I haven't pursued something like that. I tend to be rather loath to pursue certifications in various forms. I maybe it's because I'm distrusting of people in high places of power or committees. That's a bit of stuff related to me. Now, that said, getting together with like-minded people who have a passion for an area of practice or an area of study, I think that's tremendous. I think those tend to not be the people who come up with a certification for a thing. But that's my hot take on that. I have not pursued certifications other than the ones that I had some job related or very, very close tie, some other very, very strong reason to do so. So I would absolutely say somebody who's got a grief certification, that gives you at least some knowledge of what the person hopefully finds important, and they connect to that. So I like with any certification, my adventure therapy certification, that does mean I'm really, really, I really, really like that side of practice. And I would think anybody with a grief certification really, really values that, and they want to let people know that that's something that they can speak to. So I don't want to disparage anyone who's gone that path. I would just say that isn't necessarily the mark of can this person or is this person conversant in this topic, but it does at least give you a starting place. That okay, you've looked through the Psychology Today website or the WTTA list, which I would highly recommend that you start there if you're listening to this this conversation, especially if we're talking about grief, we're talking about trauma. I would strongly recommend, gosh, this is a segue I hadn't intended, but I would strongly recommend that if you're talking about grief and you are a firearm owner, that you reach out to the WTTA network before having that conversation and discussing your access to firearms. I would strongly recommend that you talk to somebody who is 2A supporting as your clinician, because things are going to get said probably when you're talking out of that strong emotion, that maybe you don't want somebody who already is inclined to think that you're a bad person for owning a firearm, that you already are a risk to society. It's a vulnerable time with a person who may actually be against your position on the Second Amendment, on freedom, and that would be an additional trauma, an additional grief to be working through that would absolutely not be helpful in the actual grief that you went to the person to discuss.
I'll give you a shameless plug, because you've got 2A mental health up and running now, and you're trying to create attendees for groups in the future. So DB, actually is doing this for gun owners. So look up 2A mental health. And I like your threads, by the way. You've got some customized hat and shirt there. That's great. I look forward to getting one myself.
Appreciate it. Yeah, I just got 2 off the presses. So the shirt and the hat, 2 of each. And so hopefully maybe it'll be some kind of, I don't know, what do we call it, merch or something down the road. But ultimately, it's just something for walking around the SHOT Show. It's been cool to see as the Walk the Talk crew will be at SHOT Show this next week. It'd be great to have conversations, to meet people, and to talk more about how do we walk the talk as firearms owners and industry in connecting people with mental health, resources, whether that's coaching, whether that's big C counseling. I'm very much looking forward to that opportunity to continue to push this conversation forward.
Hot mic, hot mic, hot mic. I thought Brandon was going to say something. He typed
So
something
did
in
I.
there.
Brandon, hop in there.
Nope, I didn't have anything. I was just going to say, too, second, Jack, I would definitely like to get one of those shirts whenever they're available.
Awesome. Well, that's probably a good place for us to stop then, being that we're all, disjointed and under the weather. And I think we've covered a lot, and it's okay to not go an hour and a half every episode. Yeah, so Sharon chimes in. She says, Jacob mentioned to many the suggestion of holding the barrel, a handgun bolt carrier group, etc., to help with those who are in need without being penalized by the Washington state horrific transfer laws. Nevada has a transfer law too. There's a bunch of states that have transfer laws that say you can't exchange serialized parts with, they actually don't say that. They say you can't give your guns to anybody without going through a background check unless they fall into these certain categories. Usually it's family member. And so the way around it is symbolically, you say, I'll hold your barrel, or I'll hold your bolt carrier group, or your firing pin, or whatever workable operational part that's non-serialized for the individual who's in the time of crisis or who's struggling. That way neither one of you become felons. And yes, of course they can go down to the gun shop and buy a new slide, or whatever. But the idea is that you're creating time and space in a symbolic gesture that says, if you're really going to go to that extent to replace the part that I'm holding on to you for you, so that you don't take your own life while you're in misery, then I guess go for it, because that's a lot of effort. The idea is to make sure that we're creating time and space to avoid the impulsive act in that place of despondency. And I would love to, give that as a reminder yet again. So if you've got somebody who's going through a tough time, we don't know if they're suicidal or not. Maybe they'll become suicidal, but maybe they just shouldn't be around their guns. As responsible gun owners, we need to take care of each other. And a great way to keep somebody safe is to take a functional, non-serialized part from their firearms. And you can take all the bolts you want. They'll fit in a bag, right? You don't have to take the full-blown gun times 14 or whatever, that doesn't fit in your safe anyway. So that's a great way to do it. And, give them back when they're ready. And I think it's a great way to start conversations with people too. Say, hey, if you're not doing so well, I'll hold your guns for you. Maybe I can't hold all your guns, but I can certainly hold a workable part that fits into a bag that I can stick in my safe at my house. And then neither one of you are breaking the law. Thanks for reminding that. She says, I just shared Rob's video on that in the chat. Rob Pincus does have a video on alternatives to transfer laws, so you can keep yourself safe and responsible. And I want to punctuate too that we also have a video that we'll eventually make more public. Right now it's behind a private thing because it's for employees of companies who sell firearms, but it's a trauma mitigation video. And I wanted to touch on that earlier when DB was talking about forewarned is forearmed. So if you have knowledge that this process is going to unfold for you, you're less likely to succumb to it in a negative way. So we talk about trauma mitigation in a sense that if you're just working reception at the firearms company, or you're working in shipping, and something negative and unfortunate happens with one of those guns that you're selling to the public, you can feel like you had a hand in that. And if you know that in advance, you avoid encountering the trauma that comes along with that bad news. So this can be generally applicable to most circumstances. So if we're pre-thinking about what can happen in life when we lose things, lose people, then we're not as stunned by it. We're not as rocked by it when that incident actually occurs. Then we don't double down on the trauma effect. So I wanted to give a plug to that. It's trauma mitigation, safe storage. Don't break the law. Do things the right way while still keeping your friends and neighbors safe. So let's do some quick takeaways. I think Brandon, you presented. What's one thing that jumps out at you from today's discussion that you're going to take with you?
I would say what you said. I mean, you taught me today that cortisol is released when you shed tears. I did not know that. I think that's something it's a really good piece of information that I can share with my patients. I'd say like my other big takeaway is the fact that you said that you bring your chair over to the person or to your patient and say something along the lines of, I don't have anything for you, but I'm here. And, kind of like I was saying earlier, when it comes to grief, it's one of the hardest things to, coach someone through because you can't get the person back, but it's a great way to show that you're there. So I think that those are my two takeaways for today.
DB?
Yeah, as soon as Brandon mentioned cortisol, I thought, oh, darn it, and he's jumped in there. That was exactly what I was going to say. This is cortisol tears. Gosh, if you are, or if you aren't, but for me, as a person of faith, what a fascinating thing to have created a creature whose the process of crying releases. Man, I guess I'm just kind of thrown in a positive way. What an amazing thing for to have been created in a way that the process of grief, of crying, of shedding that is releasing something toxic out of our body, and so actually moving through that process, owning it, living it, feeling it, crying it out is exactly doing something that we at a very core level need. And by not doing that, we're getting in the way of exactly how we were created to assist in processing that. So man, what an amazing thing. Yeah, that's my takeaway on that one.
Kev, you got a takeaway?
Yeah, I just had to respond in the chat. No, grief's a hard one. The cortisol is a great thing. We can all steal that, as we often see it as weakness, and men or tough people feel like they can't cry or shouldn't be crying. But we have proof here today in this conversation that it's a healing thing and something to be good and not ashamed of. I also like Scrubs. If there's any Scrubs fans, I had a great episode on the 5 stages of grief. So I'll plug that. But it's nice to just take a peek behind the scenes of see kind of these topics that everybody knows, but then how you guys approach them behind the scenes and demystify the counseling process a little bit, because everybody kind of experiences grief, but then how do you guys personally handle that when it comes into your office?
Well, I'm thinking just real quick. I mean, I don't know which episode it is, but in SEAL Team, which is available on streaming services. But SEAL Team season 6, one of the characters dies, unexpectedly. Close character in the story, and watching the process of the rest of the team go through that. Like, man, I'll admit it. Like, I was in tears watching the episode. After 6 seasons, I was bought into this character. I was bought into this thing. And man, what a gut punch. So one, great storytelling. And number two, what we see in that is exactly the way when things hit men hard, that was a very, very honest expression. It was anger, it was denial, great on stages of grief. And when it finally came to it, it was just an absolute breaking down. I guess we call that ugly crying. In the common terms, but man, that's not something that we do often. There's a reason for that, because grief is like, it's a really big deal. And so what we're not saying is guys should be crying all the time, but we're saying, man, when stuff hits, when it's real, we ought to do the real thing. And like, don't do the fake light version of stuff. Let's do the actual thing. And part of that, one of those things is actually doing grief. We're in it, so let's go. Let's do this thing.
Authenticity is really important, and if you strive for authenticity, then you need to be emotionally authentic too. So, to your lips, from your lips to God's ears, and to everybody else listening, be authentic. And authentic means authentically being sad too. My takeaway, I'm actually changing it. It's going to be about certifications, because I had the same, I don't know, a tendency to eye roll when I see certificates stacked up on somebody's website. it to me, it looks like an advertisement rather than an honest endeavor to be exceptional at something. But I know that there's people out there who are exceptional, and that's why they get the certificate. So I think that's a great way of framing it, is somebody's very, very interested in that thing. They may or may not be great at what they do, but they're very, very interested in it. So that's a good starting point. I really like the way you frame that, and that helps alleviate a lot of my judgment that I have on certifications. As a guy who helped create the WTTA curriculum and a level 3 certificate holder for firearms counseling, it's an inauthentic position for me to chastise or denigrate or otherwise condescend people who have certificates. So thanks for that. That's going to be my takeaway, is a little piece of humility. So thanks everybody for tuning in and paying attention and downloading and streaming and doing all the things. And again, share this around, invite people to participate. We're trying to work ourselves out of jobs. This information doesn't do any good locked up in our heads, so we're sharing it with you all to help make Earth better. So on behalf of the Walk the Talk crew, we wish you all great mental and physical wellness. See ya.